Good evening, and welcome to the fifth lesson in our series, Shadows of the Gospel. Throughout this series, we have been examining how the author of the letter to the Hebrews used the imagery of the Old Testament tabernacle to demonstrate the superiority of the gospel of Christ to the law of Moses. The Old Covenant, sealed as it was with the blood of animals, was rendered obsolete by the establishment of the New Covenant, sealed with the blood of Jesus. And the Old Testament tabernacle, with its limited and imperfect priesthood, was merely a shadow of the eternal and perfect high priesthood of Jesus. In this lesson, we're going to take a deeper look into Jesus' role as the high priest of this new covenant. The Hebrews author claimed that the high priesthood of Jesus was superior to that of the Levitical priesthood of Aaron and his descendants. And a fair question that would come up at this point is, on what basis can it be claimed that Jesus is a superior high priest? And so that will be where we're looking in this lesson this evening. In establishing the superiority of Jesus' priesthood, Hebrews introduces us to a mysterious character named Melchizedek. I'm reading from Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 5. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Just as he says also in another passage, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And then in the very next verse, the author acknowledges to his readers that they're going to have to listen very closely in order to understand the significance of Melchizedek in his argument in support of the superior high priesthood of Jesus. He says, "Concerning him we have much to say, and it's hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing." Now, if we find that we're having trouble grasping the significance of Melchizedek in the Hebrew writer's exposition here, maybe we can be justified if we attribute it to a lack of teaching rather than to a dullness of hearing. Because this is one of those difficult texts that teachers often tend to shy away from. But we're going to do our best to try to get inside the author's head and understand what he was trying to say. Now, in verse 6 of the text we just read, he refers to another passage. That passage is Psalm 110, verse 4. And there the psalmist wrote, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." This is the Old Testament foundation for the Hebrew author's entire argument about Melchizedek. In the book of Hebrews, the next reference to Melchizedek comes in chapter 6, and it is mentioned in the context of our hope as the disciples of Christ of receiving the spiritual blessings promised to the spiritual descendants of Abraham. In chapter 6, verse 19, our author says, "This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Now, the big question in all of this is, just who is this Melchizedek fellow? Why does the Hebrews author associate him so closely with Jesus? When and where did he serve as a priest? And what was it about his priesthood that both David and our author here in Hebrews found so impressive? And to find these answers, we're going to have to go back in time about 4,000 years. The only historical reference that we have to Melchizedek appears in the 14th chapter of Genesis, in connection with Abraham's rescue of his nephew Lot from foreign invaders. If you remember the story, after separating his estate from that of his uncle, Lot had settled in the notoriously wicked city of Sodom, located on the plain east of the Dead Sea. And later, when Sodom and other cities in that same area were conquered by a coalition of Mesopotamian cities and kings, Lot and his family were carried off among the captives. And when that news reached Abraham, who was called actually Abram at that time, he quickly mobilized the 318 men in his household. He pursued, caught up with, and defeated that confederation of Mesopotamian kings. And he rescued Lot along with all the other captives from the cities of the plain. That in itself was a miracle. But it's upon returning from this battle that Abram meets Melchizedek for the first and presumably the only time in his life. And that encounter is recorded in Genesis 14, beginning in verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." He gave him a tenth of all. The first thing we are told about Melchizedek is that he was a king, more specifically, king of Salem. Salem is almost certainly to be identified with the city of Jerusalem. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem prior to the conquest of that city by King David were Jebusites. Now, whether or not Melchizedek was a Jebusite, or perhaps a member of an ethnic group that occupied the city even earlier than the Jebusites did, is an unsettled matter. We really don't know. If he were a pre-Jebusite, it would mean that the Jebusite conquest of the city took place sometime during the Israelites' 40-year wandering in the wilderness, because by the time Joshua leads Israel across the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, Jerusalem is by that time very definitely a Jebusite city. So if the city had changed hands sometime between the time that Abraham meets Melchizedek and the time Joshua leads the Israelites into Canaan, it might explain why the city in Abram's time is called Salem. Later, after the Jebusite conquest, it took the name Jerusalem, which seems to be a euphonic rendering of something like Jebus Salem, which would mean Jebusite Salem or Jerusalem. Doesn't really matter either way, but Melchizedek was the king of this city that we now know as Jerusalem. The next thing we learn about Melchizedek is that he was a priest of El Elyon. That is a Hebrew term that translates God Most High. Now, the nature of this El Elyon worshipped and served by Melchizedek has long been the source of academic debate. And the preponderance in modern scholarship holds that Melchizedek was simply a priest of a pagan deity, and he found some kind of affinity with Abraham and the God that Abraham worshipped. But I do not believe that it's beyond the pale to say that Melchizedek was a believer and a worshiper and a priest of the same God whom Abram worshipped. Now, that's not to say that God revealed himself to Melchizedek in quite the same way or as fully as he had to Abraham. But that does not mean that Melchizedek could not have come into some kind of relationship with God as a result of his own search after him. And to provide some basis for that, I would refer you to Paul's words in the letter to the Romans concerning the loss of knowledge of God among the people of the very ancient world. In Romans 1, beginning verse 19, Paul wrote, "That which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." I believe that Melchizedek may very well be an exception to that rule. A believer in the true God, whose faith was the result of an honest quest for truth, based on the evidence that was available to him. In the very same book of Hebrews, in chapter 11, verse 6, we read that God rewards those who diligently seek after him. God is not trying to hide from anyone. And whoever will seek for God according to the evidence that he has on hand, his search will be rewarded. And I am inclined to think that that applies in this specific case to Melchizedek. I also think it's worth noting that Melchizedek and Abram's own words seem to confirm that they both worship the same God. Look again at the words of Melchizedek upon meeting Abram after the battle. He said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." The El Elyon worshipped by Melchizedek does not appear to be a mere localized deity like those worshipped by the Canaanites. Melchizedek's God was the God of all creation, all heaven and earth. Abram, when the king of Sodom offered to divide the spoils of the battle with him, replied in Genesis 14:22, "I have sworn to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich." Abraham would never have accepted a blessing or taken an oath in the name of any other God than the God who promised to make him the father of many nations. And then in Psalm 78, in verse 35, we find the name El Elyon used unmistakably to refer to the God of Israel. The psalmist writes, "And they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God their Redeemer." Now the English translators inverted the word order here, but the original Hebrew is exactly the same, El Elyon. And here El Elyon, God Most High, is unmistakably the God of Israel. And so, there is a good case to be made that when Abram, the Hebrew, met Melchizedek, king of Salem, they were both worshipers of the same God. But other than that, that's absolutely all we know about Melchizedek as far as the historical record is concerned. And when we turn to the book of Hebrews, we are given a portrait of Melchizedek, which at first is simply astonishing. In chapter 7 and verse 3, he says of Melchizedek that he was without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. On the surface, it would seem that this text is attributing divine qualities to Melchizedek. And some interpreters have gone so far as to say that the Melchizedek who met Abraham after the battle was really a pre-incarnate manifestation of Christ himself. But to a Jewish audience who's familiar with both the Genesis narrative and the teaching methods of the rabbis, this picture of Melchizedek given here in Hebrews would have been recognized as a form of teaching called Midrash. Midrash is a method of interpreting biblical stories that goes beyond the simple analysis of the text as written. A Hebrew scholar named Wilda Gaffney wrote that Midrashim is the plural of Midrash. She says that Midrashim discern value in texts, words, and letters as potential revelatory spaces. They reimagine dominant narrative readings while crafting new ones to stand along, not replace, former readings. Well, in less ivory towered language, let's just say that a midrash borrows or expands upon certain elements of a familiar textual narrative and uses them as a springboard into a discussion of less familiar and usually much more profound topics or concepts. Now, if you're lost by this point, stay with me. I think you'll be able to understand as we go along what we're talking about. But let's just say that Midrash, used skillfully and responsibly, was actually a brilliant way to teach deep and profound truths. The proper understanding and interpretation of Midrashic teaching usually requires familiarity with the culture and the worldview of the original audience to whom it was written. In our present case, we have a couple of Greek words, apator, which means without father, and almator, without mother. And these words were variously used in Hellenistic literature to refer to homeless children of unknown parentage, illegitimate children, or simply people who came from unimportant families. We might say the child of a nobody. But it's the first usage here, the children of unknown parentage, that I believe is probably the key to unlocking the portrait of Melchizedek given to us in Hebrews 7. Certain details relating to his identity that are not given in the Genesis text are improvised midrashically by the Hebrews author to emphasize certain points about the identity of Jesus. Now, Melchizedek appears quite suddenly in the Genesis narrative, and he exits just as suddenly. We're not told who his parents were, when and where he was born, how old he was when Abram met him, when he died. Nothing. With Melchizedek, it's simply a matter of now you see him, now you don't. And when the Hebrews author says that Melchizedek had neither beginning of days nor end of life, he's not saying that Melchizedek is eternal. He's simply saying that we don't know those dates. That's the way Midrash works. He's going to take our ignorance of those dates and make a deeper point about Jesus from that. When he says that Melchizedek is without father or mother or genealogy, it doesn't mean that he had no parents or no family tree. He's simply saying that we don't know those facts. And it's the absence of this information, especially of this genealogical record, that is significant in and of itself. Now, the critical point of this midrash is that what was true of Melchizedek only in a literary sense with regard to a paucity of historical information is literally true of Jesus. Jesus, as the second person of the Godhead, is literally without beginning or end. He is eternal. Now, with regard to his human ancestry, it might seem at first that the Midrash breaks down a little bit here. Because although Jesus had no human father, he did have a human mother, the Virgin Mary, and he had a human genealogy, which is attested by the gospel accounts of both Matthew and Luke. However, I believe the important point here is that Jesus had no father or mother or human genealogy that would in any way qualify him to be a priest under the law of Moses, because he was a descendant not of the tribe of Levi, but of the tribe of Judah. And it is of utmost importance to the Hebrew writer's argument to understand that neither Melchizedek nor Jesus could have served as a priest under the law of Moses. To be an Old Testament priest, a man must present an impeccable genealogy documenting his descent, not just from the tribe of Levi, but more specifically from the sons of Aaron. And after the Babylonian exile and the restoration of some of the people back to the land of Judah and the city of Jerusalem, there were certain priests who presented themselves whose genealogy could not be established. The records were lost or missing or unclear, and they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. That's Nehemiah 7 and 64. Now, Jesus' genealogy, as we have already noted, is traced not from Levi, but from Judah. Melchizedek's genealogy is totally unknown. It's almost as though he had no father or mother. But what we do know is this. Since he was not even an Israelite, much less a Levite, he certainly would never have been able to serve as a priest under the Old Covenant. And yet, Melchizedek is clearly presented in Genesis, in Psalms, and in Hebrews as a legitimate priest. And Jesus is declared 5 times in the book of Hebrews to be a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. We read that in Hebrews chapter 5 and verses 6 and 10, chapter 6 and verse 20, chapter 7 verses 11 and 17, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Greek word translated order is taxis. It's the source of the English word taxonomy, which is the science of classifying and organizing organisms. In this context, taxis has the meaning of a post, a position, a rank that a person might hold in civic or military or religious affairs or something such like. To say that Jesus then serves as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek is to say that he holds whatever degree of rank, prestige, or authority that Melchizedek holds. And as the Hebrews author continues his argument, he makes it clear that the order of Melchizedek is decidedly superior to that of Aaron. Melchizedek was a priest extraordinaire. In chapter 7, beginning in verse 4, the author says, "Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave 1/10 of the choicest spoils. And those indeed of the sons of Levi who received the priest's office have commandment in the law to collect 1/10 from the people, that is, from their brethren, although these are descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected 1/10 from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives on. And, so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And thus the Midrash continues. When Abraham returned from the victory over the Mesopotamian Confederation, he paid tithes to Melchizedek and received a blessing from him. Now, in this interaction, Melchizedek held the superior role of the benefactor, while Abraham played the role of the beneficiary, a subservient role. And so by extension, the author says, since their father Levi was still in the body of Abram at that time, the Aaronic priests, the Levitical priests, also paid tithes to Melchizedek. And the conclusion of that, for our author, theologically, is that the priesthood of Melchizedek is thus presented as superior to the priesthood of Aaron, because the priests of Aaron symbolically paid tithes to the high priest Melchizedek. And therefore, since Jesus is a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus' high priesthood is also superior to that of Aaron. In Hebrews 7 and verse 3, the writer makes a most important point. He says that Melchizedek is made like the Son of God. Now notice he did not say that the Son of God is made like Melchizedek, but Melchizedek is made like the Son of God in this midrashic argument. Melchizedek was a man, a human being, just the same as you or me. He had a father and he had a mother. We just don't know their names. He was born, he lived, and he died. We just don't know precisely when those events happened. All we know of Melchizedek is that he was, if for only a brief shining moment, Abraham's priest. And it is as such that he is frozen in time and memory. He remains forever in our minds as the priest who is greater even than Aaron and his descendants. Thus, it's not as though Melchizedek set a standard and Jesus conforms to it. Rather, the Hebrews author midrashically re-images the scant historical record of Melchizedek in order to illuminate some magnificent truths that apply far more fully to Jesus than they ever did to Melchizedek. So as the tabernacle was a shadow of the gospel, just so we can say that Melchizedek was a shadow of Christ. And so, through all of this complex imagery drawn from the life of Melchizedek, the Hebrews author masterfully presents to us the new, superior, perfect high priest, and his name is Jesus. Remember from a couple of lessons ago, the reasons that Jesus is an infinitely superior high priest to the sons of Aaron. First, he overcame death and lives forever. Hebrews 7 verses 15 and 16. Another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become such not on the basis of a law of physical requirement, but according to the power of an indestructible life. Second, Jesus is a superior high priest to Aaron and his sons because he was without personal sin. Hebrews chapter 5, beginning with verse 8. Although he was a son, He learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Third, Jesus' high priesthood is superior to that of Aaron because he offered a superior sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 27. He does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. When the Hebrews author introduces us to this remarkable and mysterious man, Melchizedek, he doesn't mean for us to look at him with wonder and awe. Rather, he means for us to look at Jesus through him with wonder and awe. Jesus is the reality of the great high priesthood, of which even Melchizedek was only a shadow. Next week, we will complete this series of lessons with a closer look at the superior sacrifice of the new covenant. And I hope that you'll be able to join us again at that time. Thank you, God bless you, and good night.